How I Became a Writer, A Cowboy's Tale, The Origin Story You Never Expected. Hey everyone, let me tell you how this book came to be. And spoiler alert, it all started with money. Big money dreams. Picture this. It's the winter of 1882-83, and I'm working a ranch right on the border between Indian Territory and Kansas, near a town called Caldwell. Life was rough, but we 9 cowboys had each other's backs. One day we got tired of our terrible habits, the constant swearing and, well, let's just say our hygiene standards were pretty questionable for the times. So we made a pact. Anyone caught cursing or being disgusting would pay a 10-cent fine. The money would go toward buying some quality reading material. Anything to help us rise above the stereotype of the uneducated cowboy. Plot twist. Within 24 hours, we had $3 whole in the pot. I was the treasurer, naturally. The great literature debate. That night, I was heading into town to see my girlfriend. We called them Sunday girls back then, don't ask. So I offered to subscribe to a good newspaper with our fine money. But which one? We decided to vote democratically. Each man wrote his choice on a slip of paper and dropped it in a hat. Now, 2 of our crew were young guys from Texas who couldn't read or write, so we let them speak their votes out loud. The moment we gave them the floor, they both shouted, "Police Gazette!" When we asked why they picked that particular publication, which was basically the tabloid magazine of its day, they answered in perfect unison, "Because we can read the pictures." And guess what? They won the vote. Enter Mr. Potts, my inspiration. The first issue arrived with the beginning of a serial story called Potts Turning Paris Inside Out. The main character was this broken-down New York preacher who'd somehow struck it rich. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and was living it up in Paris. I was hooked. And incredibly jealous. I spent an entire sleepless night trying to figure out how an uneducated cowboy like me could make that kind of money. I thought about the cattle boom I'd missed. If I'd been smarter earlier, I could have been one of those cattle barons. Though, let's be honest, some of them weren't exactly legitimate businessmen. But those days were over, and I needed a new plan. The light bulb moment. The next morning, while waiting for breakfast, I found a scrap of paper with this message. To the young man with high ambitions, literature offers great opportunities if he finds an unexplored niche. Another sleepless night followed as I tried to find my untrodden field in writing. Just as our rooster Deacon Bates was announcing dawn, inspiration struck. I'd write something no one had written before, my epic literary failure. So I started my first novel that very night. Without going into the problematic details of my original concept, trust me, it was a product of its time and wouldn't fly today, let me just say I created 2 main characters and set the story in a small Texas town along the Colorado River. Everything was going great until halfway through the first chapter, when disaster struck. My male lead got convicted of theft and sent to prison while I was still figuring out the plot. Then my female character completely derailed the story by running off with a completely different character I hadn't planned for. I was so frustrated that I threw the entire manuscript into the fire. Epic. Fail number 1 as an author. The birth of this book. After that disaster, I decided to try something easier, writing about what I actually knew, my own wild, crazy life as a cowboy. And that's exactly what you're reading, or watching, right now. Will this book make me rich enough to live like Mr. Potts in Paris? Well, as they say, that remains to be seen. And that's how a bunch of foul-mouthed cowboys accidentally launched my writing career. Sometimes the best stories come from the most unexpected places. Chapter 1. My childhood days. Welcome to the world, future cowboy. February 7th, 1856. That's when I made my grand entrance into this crazy world, on a narrow strip of land called the Matagorda Peninsula, in the very southern tip of Texas. Picture this: a piece of land only 1 to 2 miles wide, but stretching 75 miles long, with the Gulf of Mexico on one side and Matagorda Bay on the other. Right in the middle of this remote paradise was the Dutch settlement, and I'm using the term settlement very loosely here, since it was basically just a dozen houses scattered around. My story starts in a little frame cottage right in the center of it all. A tale of 2 continents. Here's where it gets interesting. I'm basically a walking United Nations. My father, who sadly passed away when I was just 1 year old, came all the way from sunny Italy. My mother, she journeyed from the green hills of Ireland. Talk about a cultural mix. I was destined to be unique from day one. Our closest neighbors were the Williams family, John, his wife, and their 11 kids. Yes, 11. They were basically running their own small town. My first academic adventure and disaster. Fall of 1859 brought my first taste of formal education with Mr. Hale, a teacher from Illinois. The schoolhouse was this tiny wooden building sitting all by itself about a mile from our settlement. Every morning my sister and I would make the trek barefoot through grass burrs and rough terrain. And yes, I mean completely barefoot. We'd never even owned shoes at that point in our lives. Pro tip from my childhood self: taking the beach route to avoid those painful grass burrs seemed like genius thinking, until you factor in all the distractions. The Great Crab Incident of 1859. This is where my story takes a turn toward the ridiculous. You see, I was already obsessed with cowboys. Watching them rope cattle had inspired me to practice my own lasso skills on sand crabs using a piece of fishing line while riding my trusty stick horse. One morning I spotted a huge group of crabs making their way toward the water. I spurred my imaginary pony into action and managed to corner one particularly fat crab, chasing him away from his friends. But this crab was smarter than me. Every time I threw my makeshift lasso, he'd scurry right through the loop before I could tighten it. Finally, he disappeared into a hole in the sand. That's when my brilliant young mind decided, I'm going to dig this guy out and rope him properly. When determination meets reality. So there I was, down on all fours, digging like a dog while my sister tried to convince me to come to school. Did I listen to her wisdom? Absolutely not. I told her to basically buzz off because I was going to rope that crab or bust. Here's where I learned an important life lesson about overconfidence. I kept sticking my nose down into the hole to check my progress. Big mistake. That crab was waiting for me like a tiny, vengeful monster. Wham! One claw clamped onto my upper lip, the other grabbed my nose in what felt like an iron grip. I let out a yell that probably scared every seagull within 5 miles, jumped 10 feet in the air and ran home faster than I'd ever moved in my life, with a very angry crab still attached to my face. The aftermath. Luckily, Mr. William Burge was heading to the beach and helped remove my unwanted face accessory. He had to break the crab's claws to get it loose. Ouch. I arrived at school just as the recess bell was ringing, blood all over my face. Mr. Hale took one look at me and demanded an explanation. Being the honest kid I was, I told him exactly what happened. His response? Let's just say I learned that day why they call it getting your butt kicked. And yes, I was still wearing nothing but a long shirt made from an old flour sack. Pants weren't part of my wardrobe yet. Freedom and mischief. In fall of 1861, Mr. Hale left to join the Union Army, which meant no more school and complete freedom for troublemakers like me. My partner in crime was Billy Williams, and together we became legendary in the settlement for our mischief. The local women used to say we were the meanest little imps around, and predicted we'd both end up in serious trouble before we turned 21. Our favorite activities? Riding milk calves like bucking broncos, coon hunting, and sailing toy boats along the bay shore. My first real pants, and how I ruined them. The big fashion moment of my childhood came when my aunt and uncle from Galveston sent us a trunk full of clothes, including my very first pair of real pants. White canvas breeches that were about 3 sizes too big for me. The first Sunday I got to wear them, my mother cleaned me up, squeezed me into those oversized pants, and gave me strict orders. Don't leave the yard, or else. But here's the thing about 7-year-old boys. We have zero impulse control. I'd already promised Billy we'd go coon hunting that day, and the thrill of chasing raccoons through muddy swamps with dogs was way more appealing than sitting in the yard admiring my fancy new pants. So while Mom was getting my sister dressed up, I snuck out and ran off to meet Billy and his 4 hunting dogs. The great white pants disaster. We spent the entire day hunting in the marshes, wading through waist-deep mud, chasing coons, and even bagging a wildcat. It was absolutely epic, until I remembered I had to go home. By sunset, my beautiful white canvas pants had transformed into something that looked like they'd been through a swamp monster's digestive system. I was covered in mud from head to toe. Walking into that house took more courage than any cowboy adventure I'd face later in life. My mother was waiting with the old black strap, and let me tell you, I slept soundly that night, but couldn't sit down comfortably for a week. Sometimes the best adventures come with the highest price tags. But even at 7 years old, I was learning that the cowboy life wasn't going to be easy or clean. Chapter 2. My Introduction to the Civil War. The worst Monday ever. Monday mornings were my absolute nightmare, and not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't school or chores that made me dread Mondays. It was wash day, which meant I had to haul wood from the beach to keep the washing pot boiling all day long. That particular Monday, I tried my best fake sick routine, but my mom wasn't buying it. Hard to claim you're too ill to work when she just watched you demolish 2 plates of mush and 3 hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Before heading out for my first load of wood, I strategically hid the big leather strap that hung by our door. Call it intuition, but I had a feeling this day was going to end badly for me. The Great Rabbit Chase and Sunburn Disaster. When I finally made it to the beach, I spotted a cottontail rabbit diving into a hollow log. Forget the firewood. I was determined to catch that rabbit. My brilliant plan? Dig the sand away from the log so I could roll it into the Gulf and drown the poor guy out. It was blazing hot, and digging heavy sand with just my hands and a stick was exhausting work. That's when I made a critical error. I fell asleep with my head under the log and my bare legs sticking out in the Texas sun. The sunburn was so intense, I started dreaming I'd died and gone to a place where Satan was piling hot coals on me. Then, as clouds covered the sun, my dream shifted to something beautiful. I was in heaven, surrounded by happy children, when suddenly God gave me a massive chore: carry an enormous pile of fence rails up a steep hill, one by one. I was about halfway up that dream hill thinking how I'd rather be back home carrying firewood for Mom when the most incredible noise I'd ever heard jolted me awake. An army appears from nowhere. When I managed to get the sand out of my eyes and look around, the entire beach was filled with men carrying guns, marching straight toward me. They were beating drums and blowing horns, and the front of their formation was only about 100 yards away. I did what any sensible kid would do. I ran like my life depended on it, looking back every few seconds to see if they were chasing me. The angry geese incident. In my panic, I sprinted straight into Mrs. Ziprian's flock of geese, the same geese I usually gave a wide berth, because their old ganders had a personal vendetta against me. 2 of those aggressive birds made a dive for me, and one managed to clamp onto the tail of my shirt with his beak. Picture this: me running full speed with a furious gander attached to my shirt, his claws raking the backs of my legs every time he bounced up and down. When he finally let go, I felt like I'd lost 10 pounds instantly. The ultimate collision. I burst into our yard where Mom was bent over the wash tub, scrubbing away with her back to me. Still looking over my shoulder for the army, I crashed straight into her, sending Mom, tub, and soapy water flying everywhere. She got up first, grabbed me by the shirt collar, and dragged me toward where the strap should have been hanging. When she couldn't find it, thanks, pass me, she grabbed the mush stick instead. Let me tell you, that wooden spoon delivered justice in a way I'll never forget. I tried desperately to tell her about the hundreds of soldiers on the beach, but she was too angry to listen to my excuses. Welcome to the Civil War, kid. Those men I'd seen turned out to be Dr. Piercessen's company of Confederate soldiers, sent from Matagorda to drill and prepare to fight Union forces. This was the summer of 1862, and the Civil War had finally reached our little peninsula. They set up camp about a mile from our house, and I became their unofficial mascot. Captain Pearson even gave me an umbrella to use as a pretend rifle, and I'd march with them for hours, playing soldier, when the Yankees arrived. That fall, about 5,000 Union soldiers landed at Decrose Point and marched right past our ranch on their way to engage the Confederate camp 40 miles north at Caney Creek mouth. They camped near our house for one night, and honestly, they were pretty nice to me. They shared their hardtack crackers, which was like gourmet food compared to our usual diet of mush and milk. The battle we could hear. The 2 armies fought for 5 or 6 days, and we could hear the gunfire clearly from our settlement. Neither side really won, but the aftermath was sobering. Dead soldiers kept washing up on our beach. One day, my sister and I found a poor soldier who'd been shot through the heart. His clothes were gone, but he had JT tattooed in India ink on his wrist. That image stayed with me for years, living in a war zone. After the battle, the Yankees stayed at Decrose Point while the Confederates held their position at Caney Creek. Our little settlement became a no-man's land where skirmishes happened regularly. I remember one terrifying incident when Union soldiers surrounded Mr. Williams, Billy's father, while we were with him on the prairie. They stuck pistols in his face and threatened to kill him if they ever found him away from home again. Did Mr. Williams back down? Absolutely not. That night he snuck into their camp and stole 11 of their best horses, which he gave to the Confederate forces. The Cannonball tragedy. The fighting was constant. Sometimes gunboats would battle in the bay. Other times they'd shoot right over our houses at each other. Cannonballs regularly fell on the prairie around us. One nearly buried Mr. Williams in sand as it bounced along the ground. But the real tragedy came later, when he brought one of these unexploded shells home, thinking he'd removed all the gunpowder. He set it up in the yard and asked Billy to bring him a hot coal, planning to create a little flash for entertainment. I didn't like the look of it and hid behind the fence to watch. The explosion was devastating. When the smoke cleared, Mr. Williams emerged hopping on one leg. The shell had blown off part of his foot and torn through his other leg. A piece had also taken off part of his ear. He died a few days later. Miraculously, little Maddie, who was sitting right next to it with her arms around their dog, was unharmed, though the dog lost a leg. Pieces of the shell went through their house, over my head, and we found fragments a mile away the next day. War's end and new beginnings. When the war finally ended, everyone celebrated. Mr. Joe Yeamans brought the good news from town, and we cheered with joy. But the war had changed everything. The Confederates had driven all the cattle from the peninsula to the mainland to keep them from the Union forces, leaving them scattered across hundreds of miles and wild as deer. When the men went to round them up, it became a massive operation. Billy and I were desperate to join them and become real cowboys, but we were still too young. So we practiced on our own with an old mule and a few ponies, lassoing and riding wild yearlings, preparing for our future. My big break. In spring of 1867, everything changed. A cattleman named Faldian brought his family to the peninsula for their health and rented part of our house. When he headed back to Matagorda to prepare for spring cattle work, he asked my mother if I could come with him and learn the cattle business. When she said yes, I became the happiest kid in the entire settlement. My lifelong dream of becoming a real cowboy was finally about to come true. Sometimes the worst Mondays lead to the biggest adventures. That terrible wash day introduced me to a war, and that war eventually led me to my destiny as a cowboy. Chapter 3. My first lesson in cowboy life. Welcome to the real world. The day after arriving in town with Mr. Faldian, he sent me out to his ranch 20 miles away on Big Boggy. I rode out on the supply wagon with the cook, and that very first night, we went wild boar hunting with several ranch hands. Let me tell you, this was nothing like the fun coon hunts Billy and I used to have back home. We didn't get back until midnight, completely exhausted and beat up. Our dogs were badly injured by the boar's tusks, and honestly, it's a miracle none of us got gored. When Mr. Faldian arrived a few days later with more men, we spent time gathering up the cow ponies that hadn't been used since the previous fall, then headed out to Lake Austin, a place famous for its wild cattle herds. But my cowboy dreams got put on hold fast. I got sick that summer and had to go home, where I was laid up for 2 months with typhoid fever. Everyone thought I was going to die. Enter the worst stepfather ever. That fall, around October, my mother made what turned out to be a catastrophic decision. She married a man named Carrier from up north. He claimed to own a farm in Michigan, plus lots of other property. This guy was desperate to get back to his supposed farm and convinced Mom to sell everything we owned to move north with him. Finding a buyer was tough since money was scarce after the war, but eventually, Mr. George Burkhart, a merchant in Matagorda, agreed to buy our property at his own price. The numbers were heartbreaking. Our house and 175 acres sold for just $175. Our 60 head of cattle went for $1 each, and all the cattle still on the mainland were thrown in for good measure. Goodbye, Texas. The hardest part was leaving old Brownie, our cow who'd been like family. When I was little and afraid to go home, usually because I'd done something that would earn me a beating, Brownie would let me drink her milk right there on the prairie. She was almost as old as I was. We took Chris Ziprian's schooner to Indianola, then boarded the steamship Crescent City for New Orleans. The first night out, we collided with a large ship that had been drifting for 30 days without a rudder. The people aboard were nearly starved to death. We helped rescue them and towed them safely to Galveston. The gambler reveals himself. Here's where things went from bad to catastrophic. Our ship had a bar, and my new stepfather spent every waking moment drinking whiskey and gambling. I don't think he drew a sober breath from the time we left Texas until we reached New Orleans. By the time we docked, he'd gambled away every cent from the sale of our Texas home and cattle. Mom had to dig into her secret stash, gold She'd saved before the war for hard times, just to buy tickets to St. Louis. We boarded the Grand Republic for the river journey. And guess what? Another bar, another gambling spree. He sweet-talked Mom out of her remaining money, drank and gambled it all away, and we landed in St. Louis completely broke. Rock bottom in Missouri. Mom had to pawn her feather mattress and pillows just to pay 1 month's rent in a rundown frame building on a back street. We got one room upstairs while the stingy landlord and his family lived downstairs, sharing the building with another family. The stepfather found work shoveling coal for $1 a day. At first, he brought home the full dollar each night, then 50 cents, then a quarter. Eventually, he started coming home drunk with nothing. Then one day, he just disappeared completely, leaving us with no idea what had happened to him. Mom got sick from worry and took to her bed. I went out looking for work, but got nothing but rejection, except for one old Jewish man who said he felt sorry for me. The power of prayer. What happened next changed my life forever. It had been snowing for 2 days, and it was about 5 o'clock on a bitterly cold evening. The wind was whistling through the cracks in our uninsulated walls. Mom was asleep, and my sister and I sat shivering by a nearly cold, broken stove with no fuel left in the house. My sister started crying, wondering why God let us suffer so much. I suggested it might be because we'd stopped saying our prayers, something Mom used to make us do every night back in Texas. "Let's say our prayers now then, brother," she said, wiping her tears. We knelt by that old rusty stove and prayed. The moment we finished, the door opened, and in walked Mr. Socks with a bundle under his arm. "Here, children, is a loaf of bread and some butter, and I'll bring you up a bucket of coal in a few minutes. I suppose from the looks of your stove you're cold," said this good man who'd just returned from work. Has a prayer ever been answered so quickly? We devoured that bread and butter. We hadn't eaten since the morning before. Learning to survive. The next day was sunny, and I headed uptown to find work shoveling snow from sidewalks. My first job was at a big stone house on Pine Street, where a kind lady paid me 25 cents for cleaning her sidewalk thoroughly. She even promised me work, shoveling coal in her cellar the next day. I spent the whole day shoveling snow. Most jobs only paid 10 cents for an hour's hard work, and the customers complained about the expense of snow removal. But from then on, I made a few dimes each day sawing wood or shoveling coal, and we got by. My first street fight. I should mention my first evening in St. Louis. Walking home from the bakery, I saw a crowd gathered in front of a corner grocery store. 2 boys had just finished fighting, and the storekeeper was looking for more entertainment. As I walked up with my hands in my pockets, he pointed at me and announced, "There's a country boy who I'll bet can lick any 2 boys his size in this crowd." All eyes turned to me. When they asked where I was from and I said Texas, the storekeeper got excited. By gum, if he's from Texas, I'll bet 2 to 1 he can clean out any 2 boys his size. They picked out 2 opponents, one my size, one smaller, and made fake bets just to get me to fight. I couldn't back down without looking like a coward. The fight was brutal. I got the bigger kid down and was handling him well when the smaller one grabbed a piece of brick and started pounding the back of my head. When I looked up, he nailed me over the eye with it. I jumped up, chased down the little guy, and gave him 2 black eyes before the other boy could help him. Then I chased the bigger one back to the crowd. My reward for this violence? 2 ginger snaps from the big-hearted storekeeper. I earned the nickname Tex and wore a black eye for several days. False hope in Lebanon. In mid-January, Mom got a letter from our missing stepfather with $10 enclosed, begging us to come to Lebanon, Illinois, where he claimed to have a good job. The money and his promises gave us hope, so we packed our few belongings and took the train. We found him waiting at the station, and the next morning we walked 7 miles through deep snow to Moore's ranch, where he supposedly had a job chopping cordwood. Our new home was a tiny log cabin with wind whistling through the cracks. For 1 week, everything seemed fine despite the cold and our diet of cornbread, black coffee, and old salt pork that Moore couldn't sell. Then the first Saturday came, and the stepfather went to town and got drunk, spending every penny he could find. His trips to town became more frequent than his trips to work. Eventually, I had to take a job with Moore for $8 a month just to keep us from starving. And believe me, I earned every penny working in the cold without gloves or proper clothing. Community justice. By spring, the stepfather had become such a problem that the neighbors decided to take action. One night they surrounded our cabin, dragged him outside, and gave him an ultimatum: leave by morning or be hanged. He didn't wait until morning. Scattered to the winds. Shortly after, Mom took my sister to town to find work. She left the household goods with a neighbor named Mr. Muck. Probably still there if they haven't worn out, though there wasn't much worth keeping except some good dishes we'd salvaged from a Spanish ship wrecked on the Gulf during the war. Mom found work at a boarding house. My sister got a job with Mrs. Bell, a miller's wife, and I stayed with Moore at the same pitiful wages. Betrayal and bad luck. In June, I quit Moore because I was suffering from malaria. I thought I'd saved enough money to rest until I recovered, but I discovered I only had 90 cents to my credit. Moore had deducted $35 that my stepfather owed him from my earnings. I left for town angry as could be, but soon found work with John Sargent, who promised $8 a month plus board, clothes, and medical bills. In September, Mom and sister left for St. Louis, promising to find me work in the city so we could be together again. They promised to write. I never heard from them. When I quit Sargent, I had only $1 coming to me, and I never got that either. He charged me for clothes, doctor bills, medicine, everything. One last failed attempt. I tried working for a carpenter to learn the trade for just board and clothes. A 3-year commitment. My first day was turning a heavy grindstone to sharpen his rusty tools. That night after supper, I decided I knew all I wanted to know about carpentry and ran away by moonlight. I found work at Mr. Jacobs's farm 12 miles from town for $12 a month, but the malaria was still kicking my butt, so I couldn't work much. The journey back. Finally, I made up my mind to head back to St. Louis and find Mom and sister. After buying a small satchel and a train ticket, I had only 25 cents left. I arrived in East St. Louis around midnight with just 10 cents in my pocket. I was starving but afraid to spend the dime on food because I needed it to get across the river the next morning. Looking back, I should have spent that dime on food and figured out how to get across the river for free. But I was still learning how to survive in this harsh world. Sometimes your biggest dreams turn into your worst nightmares. My first taste of cowboy life was cut short by family drama, but the real education was learning how to survive when everything falls apart. Chapter 4. My second experience in St. Louis. Starting over with 10 cents. Bright and early the next morning, I handed my last dime to the ferryman and crossed into the bustling city of St. Louis, where I immediately got swallowed up in the massive crowd along the riverfront. I left my satchel at a saloon and went searching for Mr. Socks, hoping he could tell me where my mother and sister had gone. No luck. He'd moved away from the neighborhood where I'd known him. I spent the rest of that day torturing myself by staring through bakery windows at pies and cakes, getting hungrier by the hour. My last real meal had been lunch the day before, and my stomach was starting to make some serious complaints. Selling my soul and my Bible. As evening approached, I wandered into a second-hand bookstore and asked what I could get for a nearly new Bible. The clerk told me to bring it by and he'd give me whatever it was worth. I hated the idea of selling Mrs. Moore, a sweet old lady back at the farm, had given it to me as a gift. But hunger has a way of changing your priorities real fast. I got 25 cents for that Bible and immediately spent 15 cents on a mince pie. Best investment I'd made in days. That night I found an empty cardboard box behind a store to sleep in. My dreams were filled with snakes and other nightmarish creatures. Probably my subconscious telling me how low I'd sunk. The fake job scam. The next day was another fruitless job hunt. I bought a 5-cent ginger cake for lunch and a 5-cent pie for dinner, which left me completely broke with nothing else to sell. That night, I slept in a pile of hay bales stacked behind a store. The following morning, I hit the streets again, this time on a completely empty stomach. Around 2 p.m., I struck gold. A hack driver said he needed a boy to take care of his horses. He wouldn't be going home until about 1 a.m. and told me to wait for him in front of the courthouse on 4th Street. I was so excited about the prospect of a real job, a hot meal, and a warm bed that I got to the courthouse early and waited there for hours. As the night wore on, I watched hack after hack pass by, each one giving me hope until it disappeared around the corner. Around 2 a.m., while I was leaning against a lamppost scanning the street, a police officer jabbed me in the ribs and told me to find a hole or he'd throw me in jail for being out so late. I hid across the street until he left, then went right back to my post. By 3 a.m., with a splitting headache from hunger and exhaustion, I realized the truth. The hack driver had played a cruel joke on a desperate kid. An angel appears. I was sitting on the curb with my face in my hands, crying, when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I thought it was another cop, but when I looked up, I saw a small, red-faced man with kind eyes asking, "Is there anything I can do for you, son?" His kindness broke me completely. I sobbed out my whole story, and he got furious when he heard about the hack driver's trick. He promised that if I saw the guy again, he'd teach him about playing cruel jokes on children. He took me to a fancy restaurant right across the street, his boarding house, and told me he'd spotted me from his window and could tell I was in trouble. When he learned I hadn't had a proper meal in 3 days, he was outraged. This stranger told the night clerk to fix me a good supper and give me a comfortable room, and to let me stay until I found work, even if it took a month. He'd arrange everything with the owner in the morning. I thanked him through my tears. Sometimes angels really do appear when you need them most. The planter's house. I slept until almost noon. First real rest I'd had in days. After breakfast, I went job hunting again with no luck. 3 days later, I approached an older gentleman on the street, asking about work. He smiled and said, "Son, this is the 4th time you've asked me that same question in 3 days. You must like my looks because I've watched you pass dozens of other men without stopping them." I explained that I only approached people with kind faces because I'd been turned down harshly so many times. He must have seen something in me because he said, "Follow me, and I'll find you work before we stop walking." True to his word, he marched me into the Planter's House Hotel on 4th Street and talked the owner into hiring me as a bellboy. He vouched for me so strongly that the owner gave me the job on the spot, $10 a month plus tips. I was so grateful I offered to pay him back as soon as I earned some money. He told me I could repay him by being a good person, living the high life. Working at the Planter's House was like winning the lottery. I worked the morning shift from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. with 4 other bellboys. Between our salaries and tips, we made great money. Sometimes 25 cents to $5 per day in tips alone. The gamblers were the best tippers. They'd get together for card games, send us for drinks, and sometimes hand us a $10 or $20 bill, telling us to keep the change. With that kind of money, we lived it up exploring the city after our shifts. Pride goes before the fall. Nearly a year later, I got into a fight with another bellboy named Jimmy Byron, who called me a liar. When it was over, the desk clerk, Mr. Cunningham, called me to the counter and slapped me without saying a word. I was so furious that I marched straight to my room, packed my bag, and demanded my final pay from the owner. He was shocked and tried to convince me to stay, but I was seeing red. My plan was to buy a gun and come back to settle the score with Cunningham. I left with $18 in my pocket and rode a streetcar down to the riverfront. After stashing my suitcase at a saloon, I found a gun shop and bought a fancy little ivory-handled 5-shooter for $10. The ring-toss disaster. Heading back to the hotel, still burning with anger, I came across a crowd gathered around one of those ring-toss games where you pay a quarter to try to win knives. I watched for a while, then decided to try my luck. Big mistake. I won a small knife on my first throw, which got me hooked. Quarter after quarter disappeared until all my money was gone. $5 whole down the drain, plus the 10 I'd spent on the gun. Standing there broke and humiliated, I forgot all about my revenge plan. Instead of wanting to hurt Cunningham, I wanted to kick myself for being such an idiot. Stowaway to New Orleans. I rushed back to the riverfront and learned that the steamboat Bart Able was leaving for New Orleans in minutes. I grabbed my satchel and decided to sneak aboard. Anything to get closer to my Texas home, even if I had to break every rule to do it. When the purser came around collecting fares, I broke down and told him my whole story through tears. I begged him to let me work for my passage. After thinking it over, he agreed to find me something to do. The accident. Everything went smoothly until we stopped at a landing to load grain. My job was sewing up damaged grain sacks, running back and forth between the crew working in the bow and stern of the boat. The cargo was stacked so high it formed narrow corridors between the front and back. When someone called for me from the bow, I grabbed my twine and started jogging through the passage. Halfway through, I thought I heard my name called from behind me. I stopped to listen, and being exhausted, I leaned against what I thought was a wall of grain sacks. Instead, it was an old hatchway opening, and I fell straight through onto the bare wooden ribs of the boat below. Sometimes when you're running toward something, you end up falling into something completely unexpected. That tumble was about to change my life in ways I never could have imagined. Chapter 5. A New Experience. Waking up from a nightmare. The next day around noon, I slowly came back to consciousness. I found myself alone in a comfortable little room, lying on a soft bed, but when I tried to get up, nothing doing. My back felt completely broken. I couldn't remember what had happened to me until a doctor walked in and explained everything. The steamboat captain, just as they were about to leave port, had been walking through the passage when he heard my groans coming from the cargo hold below. He got a lantern, ladder, and helped to fish me out. Barely alive. I was in the captain's private room getting the best care possible. The back of my head was swollen beyond recognition from hitting a cross timber while my back had landed across another beam. The doctor told me I owed my life to the captain's quick discovery. If you'd stayed down there 20 minutes longer, your case would have been hopeless. Memphis and the one-legged bandit. We finally reached Memphis, Tennessee, traveling slowly because we had to stop at every small landing to load and unload cargo. Thinking a little walk might help my injured back, I carefully made my way along the riverbank. During my stroll, I came across some small birds and, having my pistol with me, took a shot at them. The gunshot attracted 2 local boys. The older one was on crutches, missing a leg, and he asked how much I wanted for my shooter. I told him $10 since I desperately needed money. After examining it carefully, he said, "It's a deal, buddy. But you'll have to come up to that little house over there to get the money. I don't have that much with me." The house was about half a mile away, and I told him I was too weak to walk that far because of my back injury. "Well," he said, "come with us as far as that big sand hill over there, and my friend here will run ahead and get the money while we wait." The setup. I agreed, not suspecting anything was wrong. But once we got behind the sandhill, out of sight from the steamboat landing, the one-legged kid pulled my own gun on me and ordered me to put my hands up. I obeyed and stayed perfectly still while his buddy went through my pockets, taking everything I had, even my suitcase key. I was terrified that his trembling finger might accidentally hit the trigger while that cocked revolver was pointed at my face. As soon as they released me, I went straight back to the landing and reported the robbery to a policeman who took off after them. But I never found out if he caught them because the Bart Able steamed away shortly afterward, stranded in New Orleans. That same evening after we arrived in New Orleans, the Bart Able headed back north to St. Louis, leaving me completely broke and alone among strangers. I felt pretty hopeless that evening walking up and down the crowded riverfront trying to figure out my next move. I'd already been to the Morgan Steamship office begging for a chance to work my way back to Texas, but got nowhere. Even if I could find work, my back was still so stiff I couldn't bend over without excruciating pain. That night I slept under an old tarp spread over some sugar sacks. Survival mode. The next morning I walked about a mile down the river where dozens of small boats were being unloaded. Several were carrying oranges and bananas, and the overripe bananas that fell off during unloading became my breakfast. Big mistake. By afternoon I had the worst headache of my life from those rotten bananas. That night I tried to sleep on a pile of cotton bales, but the headache was so severe I barely got any rest. The next morning, I discovered there was a Morgan steamship in from Texas, so I approached the captain about a free ride home. The pot-bellied jerk wouldn't even talk to me. Rock bottom. By afternoon, I was getting weak from hunger and my back was killing me. I sat down on an old stove at the foot of Canal Street and didn't move for 3 solid hours. I simply didn't have the energy. Finally, a well-dressed man around 50, carrying an umbrella, came out of Kwan's office nearby and walked over to me. In a gruff voice, he said, "Young man, what are you sitting out here in the sun for? So upright and stiff, like you're nailed to that old stove." I told him about my injured back and laid out my whole situation. His tone softened considerably and he made me an offer. "Son, I'm going to give you a choice. I'll pay you $4 a month to help my wife around the house, and after 4 months I'll give you a free pass to Texas. I'm an agent for Queen's Red River Boat Line, so I can get passes easily. A new life in New Orleans." I accepted immediately and thanked him from the bottom of my heart. We boarded a Canal Street streetcar just as the sun was setting. After about a half-hour ride, we walked up to a beautiful house at 18 d'Aubigny Street. When he rang the bell, a servant named Anne answered. The inside was absolutely stunning, furnished in grand style. Mr. Myers introduced me to his wife as a little Texas boy who'd strayed from home and was about to starve. After dinner, Mrs. Myers, whom the servants called Miss Mary, showed me to the bathhouse and told me to give myself an extraordinarily good scrubbing. I'm not sure the bath improved my appearance much since I didn't have any clean clothes. My suitcase had been stolen during my illness on the river. The makeover. The next day, Miss Mary took me to a clothing store and outfitted me in fine style. I loved everything except the narrow-brimmed hat and pointed-toe dress shoes. I wanted a wide-brimmed hat and cowboy boots, but she said that would make me look too much like a country boy. the street fight that healed my back. That evening I got a black eye, but it came with an unexpected benefit. Around 4 o'clock, after Mr. Myers came home from work, we all went out on the front steps to enjoy the fresh air. There was a group of boys playing at the corner, and I asked permission to go watch them for a while. Both Mr. and Mrs. Myers said yes, but warned me not to stay long because they didn't want me getting into the habit of mixing with street loafers. When I walked over, all eyes turned toward me. One kid yelled, "Hello, fancy boy, when did you arrive?" Another remarked, "He's a stuck-up jerk, isn't he?" I decided there was nothing worth seeing and turned to leave. Just as I turned around, a young black boy snuck up behind me and pulled my hair, clearly put up to it by the white kids. I jumped on him faster than lightning and completely forgot about my sore back. We were evenly matched in size, so it was a real battle, but I finally got him down and bloodied his nose good. As I stood up, he kicked me over the eye with his heavy boot, hence the black eye, which swelled to enormous proportions within minutes. I expected a scolding from the Myers, but they both praised my courage for standing up for myself. They'd witnessed the whole thing. Somehow that fight took the kink out of my back. From that day forward, it started healing. Though I still have problems with it when I catch cold or do heavy work. Sometimes the best medicine isn't what the doctor ordered. That street fight did more for my back than weeks of bed rest ever could. Chapter 6. Adopted and sent to school. A real family at last. Mr. and Mrs. Myers didn't have any children, and after I'd been with them about a month, they made me an incredible offer. They wanted to adopt me, or at least have me promise to stay with them until I turned 21. Their plan was generous beyond my wildest dreams. They'd send me to school until I was 17, then set me up in business. They even promised to leave me everything they owned when they died. I couldn't believe my luck. After all the abandonment and betrayal I'd experienced, here were people who actually wanted to invest in my future. School troubles begin. They enrolled me in Fisk's public school right away since I'd forgotten most of what Mr. Hale had taught me back in Texas. But I hadn't been there long when I had my first run-in with the teacher, Miss Finley. Here's what happened. A boy sitting behind me hit me in the neck with a slate pencil. When I turned around and confronted him, he whispered, "You're lying." So I punched him in the nose and he started crying like a baby. Miss Finley called us both up for punishment. She gave the other boy 5 whacks with a ruler, then told him to sit down. When it was my turn, I held out my hand like a man and took 5 hits. But then she raised the ruler to strike again. I jerked my hand away and told her it wasn't fair to punish me more when the other kids started the whole thing. She insisted on giving me more punishment, so I held out my hand for 5 more whacks. When she still wasn't satisfied and wanted to continue, I'd had enough. I went back to my seat. She kept telling me to come back, but I refused. Finally, she sent a boy upstairs to get Mr. Dyer, who taught the older boys. I'd seen Mr. Dyer discipline students before and had no intention of letting him get his hands on me. When I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, I made a break for the door. Miss Finley tried to block my way, but I ran right through her, probably knocked her over in the process, and didn't stop until I got home. Private school and better days. About a week later, Mr. Myers enrolled me in a private school where I studied German, French, and English under an old gentleman who only took a few select students. Everything went smoothly for months until the following spring. The knife fight that changed everything. It was May or June when everything fell apart. During lunch break, we all finished eating and headed to the green to play games. There was a boy named Stem Camp who was always trying to pick fights with me. He was twice my size, so I usually avoided him. But this time, he called me a liar, and I couldn't let it slide. During the fight that followed, I pulled out a little pearl-handled knife that Miss Mary had given me just days before. I was determined to use it if I got the chance. The situation escalated quickly. I was on all fours with him on my back, punching me in the face. The only place I could reach with the knife was his legs, so I stabbed him just below the groin and ripped downward. He jumped 10 feet in the air screaming. When I got back on my feet, he tried to run, but I caught up and got another slash at his back. I thought I'd seriously injured him, but later found out I'd only torn his clothes. Running away again. By the next day, I was on my way to St. Louis, hidden among cotton bales on the steamboat Molly Able. I was running scared, thinking I might have seriously hurt that boy. The second night out, we had a major accident. One of the engine cylinder heads exploded, nearly killing the engineer and fireman along with several other people. A young black boy who was also stowing away and I were sleeping on lumber near the engine when it blew. We both got badly scalded by the steam. The boat ran ashore and stayed there until morning, then limped the rest of the way on one paddle wheel. It took us 8 full days to reach St. Louis, back to square one. I spent one day in St. Louis without food, avoiding the planter's house and anyone who might recognize me. Then I walked 25 miles to Lebanon, Illinois, hoping to find news about my mother and sister. I left around noon and didn't arrive until 9 at night. I went straight to Mrs. Bell's house where my sister had worked, but learned nothing about their whereabouts. Mrs. Bell gave me a bed for the night, and the next morning I went job hunting. I found work with an old employer, Mr. Jacobs, 12 miles from town. But I only lasted a short while before I started missing life with Miss Mary. So one morning I quit and headed back to St. Louis. The great steamboat race. I had enough money for train fare to St. Louis, and arrived just as the famous steamboats Robert E. Lee and Natchez were about to start their legendary race to New Orleans. Since the Robert E. Lee was my favorite, I jumped aboard just as she was pulling away. I had to stay hidden most of the time, especially from the captain and purser, but the cook thought I was great and kept me fed. The Natchez probably would have won, but she got cocky trying to take a shortcut through an old canal near Memphis and got stuck in the mud, facing the music. The first thing I did after landing in New Orleans was find one of my friends to check on my victim. He told me the boy was up and walking around on crutches, but had nearly lost his leg from the injury. I figured if they arrested me, Mr. Myers had enough influence to help me out, so I gathered my courage and headed home. Welcome back. Mr. and Mrs. Myers were absolutely thrilled to see me return, though they had quite a job getting me cleaned up again since I was filthy from the journey. A few days later, Mr. Myers went to see my old teacher to find out if he'd take me back. At first, the man said no amount of money could convince him to deal with me again, but eventually, Mr. Myers talked him into giving me one more chance. So the next morning, I shouldered my books and headed back to school to resume studying German, French, and English, hoping this time I could keep my temper and my knife in check. Sometimes the people who believe in you most are the ones you disappoint the worst. But real love means getting second chances, even when you probably don't deserve them. Chapter 7. Back at last to the Lone Star State. The final escape. Everything was going well until late November when I left for good. Here's how it happened. One afternoon, a fire broke out near the school, and everyone was rushing past our windows to see the excitement. I got caught up in the moment and asked my teacher if I could go watch. He refused in a gruff voice. That didn't stop me. I bolted for the door and was soon lost in the crowd of people rushing toward the fire. The next anyone heard of me I was on the open ocean. I'd boarded a Morgan steamship called the St. Mary and hidden myself until we were too far out to sea for them to turn around and drop me off. It was a rough crossing. We lost one of the paddle wheel houses in terrible storms, and the ship was pretty beat up by the time we reached Galveston, Texas. So, close to family. During the few hours we were docked in Galveston, I spent my time searching for my uncle, Nick White, whom I'd never met but who'd been living there for 17 years. Finding his address wasn't hard, but when I got to his house, I couldn't bring myself to go in and introduce myself. I was worried he'd think I was just looking for charity or sympathy. So I stood at his gate for a few minutes, admiring the beautiful landscaping in his yard, then walked back to the ship, just as it was preparing to leave. Looking back, I wonder how different my life might have been if I'd found the courage to knock on that door. Welcome home to Texas. We arrived in Indianola at sunrise, and I recognized several old friends standing on the wharf before we even docked. Among them was my godfather, Mr. Haggerty, who had stood for me when I was baptized by the Catholic priest years earlier. Everyone was shocked to see me back. Mr. Haggerty took me home with him and told me to make myself comfortable until I could find work. Back to work and bad habits. Within a week, I found a job with Mr. H. Seligson, who ran a meatpacking plant 5 miles out of town. He paid me $15 a month all winter. My first month's wages went to buy a fancy pistol, the second month, or part of it, for a pair of star-topped cowboy boots, and everything else went to gambling. There were lots of Mexican workers at the plant, and after hours, some of them would deal Monte, a Mexican card game, while the rest of us played against the house, visiting the old homestead. In early February, I quit the packing house and went to Matagorda, where all my old friends welcomed me back. From there, I took a trip to the settlement on the peninsula to see our old homestead. Everything looked exactly the same. The cedar and fig trees were covered with little red-winged blackbirds, seemingly the same ones that had been there when I left nearly 3 years earlier, the preacher and the dirt farm. After a week in the settlement, I returned to Matagorda and went to work for Mr. Joseph Yeamans, a Baptist preacher. The job was farming, and my wages would be a share of whatever we grew. Mr. Yeamans's farm was a 30-acre patch of sand on the peninsula, about 40 miles above the settlement. Our goal was to grow watermelons and sweet potatoes, but when I left, it looked like we'd have a bumper crop of grass burrs and very little else. The old preacher and I lived alone in a run-down shack with a dirt floor. Our diet consisted of black coffee, hardtack crackers, and whatever raccoons or possums we could catch. We had 3 good coon dogs, so we never lacked for fresh meat, even if it wasn't exactly prime beef. The maverick explanation. There were plenty of mavericks wandering around nearby, and I kept trying to convince the old man to let me butcher one occasionally for a change of diet. But he thought it was wrong to kill cattle that didn't belong to us. For those who don't know what a maverick is, let me explain. Back in the early days, a man named Maverick settled on the Lavaca River and started a cattle ranch. He was too soft-hearted to brand or earmark any of his cattle, while all his neighbors marked theirs. So, Mr. Maverick claimed everything that had long, uncut ears. When the Civil War started, Maverick had to leave his wife and children to fight for the Confederacy. When he came home after the war, he found his cattle scattered across 1,000 hills, thousands upon thousands of unbranded animals. But when all his neighbors returned from the war and started branding 5 years' worth of new calves, Mr. Maverick suddenly didn't feel so wealthy. He made a huge fuss about it, but there was nothing he could do. Within a few years, all his cattle wore some other rancher's brand, and he was left with nothing. That's where the term maverick comes from. People used to say, "There goes one of Mr. Maverick's animals." Now they just say, "There goes a maverick," meaning any unbranded cattle that belong to whoever catches them first. My real cowboy career begins just about the time we got our crops planted, sweet potatoes, melons, and such. I decided I'd had enough of farming and took off for town, leaving Mr. Yeamans my share of the crop as a free gift. Back in Matagorda, I hired on with Mr. Tom Nee, who was there recruiting cowboys for Rancho Grande, one of the largest ranches in all of Texas, owned by Shanghai Pierce and Allen. To give you an idea of its size, the year after I started working there, we branded 25,000 calves in just one season. 5 of us young men, all about the same age, sailed to Palacios Point where the ranch kept their horse herd for spring work. It was mid-April 1871 when our group of about 20 cowboys headed out for the main ranch at the head of Tres Palacios Creek. The journey took several days because we branded calves and mavericks along the way. Wild horses and wilder times. A few days after we reached headquarters, old Shanghai Pierce himself arrived from Mexico with about 300 head of wild Spanish horses. We young cowboys had a wild time learning the art of riding bucking broncos. We spent several days at the ranch preparing for a 2-month cattle drive. The ranch had its own store, so I outfitted myself properly, spent 2 or 3 months' wages on spurs, gear, and everything I needed to look like a genuine cowboy from Bitter Creek. 3 different crews headed out at the same time. One to work up the Colorado River, another to work around the home range, and ours. 15 men with 100 horses, mostly wild ones, and a chuck wagon loaded with coffee, flour, molasses, and salt. Tom Nee was our boss. Finally, at age 15, I was living my childhood dream. I was a real Texas cowboy. Sometimes you have to run away from everything good in your life to find what you were really meant to do. My cowboy adventure was finally beginning for real. Chapter 8. Learning to rope. Wild steers. Building the herd. We set up operations on the Navidad River and got to work gathering a herd of trail cattle while branding mavericks at the same time. Some days we'd brand as many as 300 or 400 mavericks, none younger than 2 years old. After about a month of backbreaking work, we had 1,100 head ready to turn over to Mr. Black, who'd bought them for delivery at the Snodgrass Ranch. These were all old, tough, longhorn steers, ranging from 7 to 27 years old, the kind with horns that could span 6 feet across. When city folks meet Texas cattle, Mr. Black was a Kansas businessman who'd brought his own crew of city cowboys and horses to drive the herd north. Big mistake. Some of his men had never even seen a Texas longhorn, and by the time they crossed the Red River into Indian territory, they had nothing left but their supply wagon and horses. They'd lost every single steer, and Mr. Black returned to Kansas completely broke. Many of those steers found their way back to their original ranges, and Shanghai Pierce got the satisfaction of selling them again to the next unsuspecting buyer. Shanghai went to Kansas the following year and came back with stories of meeting Mr. Black working at his old trade, blacksmithing. According to Shanghai, Black cursed Texas up and down and swore he'd never deal with longhorns again, even if he lived to be as old as Isaac, son of Jacob. New ownership, new adventures. After getting rid of Mr. Black's herd, we focused entirely on branding mavericks. When we returned to headquarters in early August, we discovered the ranch had changed hands while we were gone. Shanghai Pierce and his brother Jonathan had sold their interests to Allen, Poole and Company for the impressive sum of $110,000. That shows what could be accomplished in those days with no money, just nerve and a branding iron. The Pierce brothers had arrived from the north just a few years earlier, poorer than skimmed milk. Everything had changed, including the ranch location. It had been moved 4 miles downriver to Mr. John Moore's place, since Moore was now the big chief. A new boss and new freedom. In mid-August, we headed out again with fresh horses, 6 per man, and a brand new boss, Mr. Wiley Kuykendall. Some of the boys were sad to see Mr. Nee go, but I was thrilled with the change. Nye wouldn't let me rope large steers or fight when I got angry. I remember him giving me grief for knocking out someone with a club, and another time he slapped me down for trying to stab one of the boys with a butcher knife. Big Sandy. Wild country, wild people. We started working Big Sandy in Lavaca County in early September, an area famous for wild brush cattle. Very few people lived in that remote section, which explained why there were so many unbranded cattle roaming free. To give you an idea of the kind of people who did live on Big Sandy, let me tell you about a little adventure I had with another cowboy shortly after we arrived. While herding a bunch of cattle we'd gathered the day before, we spotted a man on foot emerge from thick timber and head straight for a spotted pony that was hobbled and grazing in the open. He was quite a sight, half naked, with nothing on his head but a thick mat of almost gray hair, and his feet and legs were completely bare. We decided to rope him and bring him to camp, so we grabbed our lassos and spurred our tired horses into action. He saw us coming, and being only about 100 yards from the spotted pony, ran to it, cut the hobbles holding its front legs together, jumped on bareback, and took off like lightning. That pony must have been well trained because he guided it without any reins. A 400-yard race for his life brought him to the brush, dense timber covered with thick underbrush of live oak. He disappeared like an arrow just barely ahead of us. We had to give up the chase because we couldn't use our ropes in that thick brush. Meeting the locals. The next day we made camp close to where he'd vanished, and several of us followed his trail. We found him living with his 3 grown daughters. His wife had died recently, in a tiny 1-room log cabin in a lonely spot about 2 miles from the prairie where we'd first seen him. The whole family looked pretty rough. The girls claimed they'd never seen a town in their lives. They had about 2 acres under cultivation and somehow made their living from that tiny plot. Their nearest neighbor, Mr. Penny, lived 10 miles west, and the nearest town was Columbus. On the Colorado River, 50 miles east, dawn raids on wild cattle. Since the cattle hid in the brush during the day and only came out to graze in small prairies at night, we had to do most of our work in the early morning, starting an hour or 2 before daylight. Here's how it worked. About 2 hours before dawn, the cook would holler, "Chuck." Then Mr. Wiley would go around yelling, "Breakfast, boys, get up," a few times in our ears. After breakfast, we'd saddle our ponies, which had been staked out the night before, and head for a specific prairie 3 or 4 miles away, all except 2 or 3 men who stayed behind to bring up the herd we'd already gathered once it got light enough to see. When we reached the edge of the prairie, we'd dismount and wait for daylight. At the first hint of dawn, the cattle grazing out in the open would turn their heads toward the nearest timber and start moving at a steady pace toward safety. We'd ride around through the brush unseen until we reached the point of timber they were heading for. When it got light enough to see clearly, we'd ride out with ropes ready to intercept them. Often, one of the old-timers, maybe a 15 or 20-year-old steer that was always on guard, would spot us before we got 20 yards from cover. Then the real fun would begin. The whole bunch, sometimes 1,000 head, would stampede straight toward us. Wild brush cattle always run toward the nearest timber, never away from it. Prairie-raised cattle do the opposite. When we made contact, every man would rope and tie down one of the best animals in the bunch. Occasionally, someone would get more than he could handle, and would have to struggle until another cowboy finished his job and came to help. Rookie mistakes and close calls. I got into several dangerous situations on this trip because I was still learning the business. One time I was riding at full speed and threw my rope on a steer just as he reached the timber. I couldn't stop my horse in time, so the steer went on one side of a tree, my horse on the other, and since my rope was tied hard and fast to the saddle horn, we all crashed into that tree in a heap. Later that same day, I roped a large animal and got my horse jerked over backwards on top of me. As the horse got up, I became tangled in the rope and couldn't free myself until Jack, a black cowboy nearby, came to my rescue. I was in a terrifying situation. The pony was wild, and there I hung from its side with my head down, while the steer, still attached to the rope, was trying its best to gore us both. Winter shipping operations. Just before Christmas, Moore selected our outfit to handle shipping at Palacios Point, where a Morgan steamship landed twice a week to take on cattle for the New Orleans market. We typically shipped about 500 head at a time. After loading one bunch, we'd head right back to meet one of the 3 gathering crews with another herd. We kept this up all winter, and it was brutal work during what turned out to be an unusually cold and wet season. The deadly cold. Towards spring, the cattle became terribly thin, and during the cold nights while we were night herding them, many would lie down in the mud and freeze to death. I've seen as many as 50 dead cattle scattered across the ground where the herd had drifted during a single night. Nights like those really tested our nerves. Sometimes it would be midnight before we got the cattle loaded aboard the ship. But when we finally finished, we'd have ourselves a celebration, filling up on Mr. George Burkhart's whiskey. Mr. Burkhart kept a store at the point well stocked with Cowboy delight. In fact, he specialized in the stuff. Our camp was 3 miles from the point, and some mornings the cook would wake up to find several saddled horses standing around camp waiting for their feed, their riders having passed out somewhere along the way back from town. Learning to be a real cowboy meant learning that cattle, weather, and whiskey could all be equally dangerous. But there was no other life I'd rather have lived.